A reading now from Matthew's Gospel. We continue looking at Matthew as we walk through the lectionary together. Matthew 18. Listen now, friends, for the word of the Lord. Then Peter came to Jesus and said to him, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, the one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their Lord all that had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One Sunday morning, a mother went in to wake her son and tell him it was time to get ready for church, to which he replied, "I'm not going." "Why not?" she asked. "I'll give you 2 good reasons. 1, they don't like me. And 2, I don't like them." His mother replied, "Well, I'll give you 2 reasons why you should go to church. 1, you're 59 years old. And 2, you're the pastor." Now, in case you're worried, I'm nothing like that pastor. I'm only 47. In all seriousness, though, I do love you all, and I'm glad to be here. But relationships are hard. They don't come easy, do they? Especially the relationships that matter the most to us. They take effort, the most effort to maintain. And it's not even maintenance. I mean, we talk about maintaining relationships, but maintenance sounds like we're keeping things the same. With relationships, there should be growth, right? Should be growth. I grow, you grow, the relationship grows. But that is not easy, and it doesn't just happen. It takes energy, it takes deliberate effort, and a lot of imagination. And I want to argue today that imagination is lacking in our wicked servant today. It shows in his relationships that we see. So let's take a look. Matthew 18, the parable is often called of the wicked servant. The wicked servant. He is wicked, he owes a debt, and he is forgiven that debt. And he turns around, and his great wickedness is what, right? He is then approached by somebody who owes him a debt, that he will not forgive. Right? And that is the wicked servant, the parable of the wicked servant. And of course, Jesus tells us this in response to Peter's question, how many times should I forgive somebody? 7 times? No, 77. And of course, we know 77, that's just a number. He's telling us we're to forgive. The amount of times is not relevant. We're to forgive. If you want to be forgiven, Jesus is teaching us, be forgiving. If you want to be forgiven, be forgiving. The way that Jesus tells the parable, it's easy to follow along. It's easy to see the fault with this wicked servant. It's easy to see how he is wicked and why he's wicked. And we can sit here and think, well, what is this guy's problem? What a jerk. What a fool, right? But then we might consider, you and I, those times when we get angry at someone for cutting us off in traffic, and then what do we do a moment later? But cut somebody else off? Or we might think about the occasion where we yelled over somebody else that they weren't listening to us. Yeah? Or insert your own example here. Because I'm sure we're aware that we beg for forgiveness, we're not always very forgiving. We get stuck. We let things devolve in our relationships. We hold grudges, and we know that Jesus teaches us otherwise. We can feel it in our heart when we're doing it. It's not right. So why do we do that? Why? Why do we do that? Well, the answer for our servant is that the incredible grace of his master did not change him. Our servant's no different at the end of the parable than he is at the beginning of the parable. And you would think being forgiven a debt would change his heart. And heart is important here because Jesus is always after our minds, but here he's after our hearts. He says we have to forgive another from our hearts in Matthew. Servant's heart isn't changed. Why? Well, I have a theory. And it may only be a theory, but I think it's a good one. The servant wasn't changed because the servant couldn't truly understand what had been done for him. He had no imagination for it. Yeah, there's that word, imagination. His focus was on what he was freed from, but not what he was freed for. Now, what do I mean by that? Follow me here. A few years ago, you may remember this. We had to wear masks a lot. And there were a lot of people who wanted to argue that we shouldn't be forced to wear a mask, right? They wanted to argue for their freedom. And then others were concerned about the public health and safety, right? And it was an argument back and forth. The conversation was most often in terms of freedom from, right? Freedom from being forced to do something I don't want to do. That's a freedom from mindset. Our servant in the parable is stuck in a freedom from mindset. Let me explain. If you were free from all of your debts, social, financial, all of your debt, what would you do? What would you do with your freedom? Would you travel? Would you start a new business? Would you meet new friends, seek a life partner? Would you seek a way to help out others in your life or others in your community? What would you do if you were set free from anything that encumbers you now? Right? Our servant in the parable has just been set free. And think of all the things that he can do with his freedom. He could have thrown a party. He could have helped someone else in need. He could have spent time with his family, right? We're told he has a family. I don't know, but he could have done anything except what he did. Which is what? He goes out and he bumps into someone who owes him a little bit of money, and he is vicious and unmerciful. And just see this. He's stuck in a freedom from mindset. But he has no imagination of what to do with his new freedom. No imagination at all. I hope you see the difference between freedom from and freedom for, because it's going to be important to us. And imagination is the key to unlocking freedom for. By the way, this is a bit of an aside. I hope you'll bear with me, but it's not much. When I hear people today talk about what is wrong with us, what's wrong with our society, I think about this. I worry sometimes that we outsource our imagination too much. We let corporations, politicians, Hollywood, media influencers, and people like that imagine for us what life would be like if we give them our money or our votes or our attention, right? And I worry that imagination is like a muscle, that we have to use it or lose it. I've heard it suggested, if you'll follow me here, that war is a profound lack of imagination, right? Our group disagrees with their group, and we can't come up with, we can't imagine a way of resolving our differences, so we resort to fighting. And so we see a rise of gun violence in our country. We hear chatter of civil war in our country. It's a lack of imagination of how to rise above our problems and our differences. A lack of imagination for how life can be when we cooperate with each other, work together, dream, solve problems together. It's a lack of imagination. And I would argue that imagination has been one of our people's greatest gifts to the world, our country's greatest gifts. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington imagined a new way of governance. Dorothy Day and Susan B. Anthony imagination prompted new people to have a voice in society who hadn't before. We have the Wright brothers and Steve Jobs with an amazing imagination for products and technology. Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass were certainly people of imagination and vision. Our society has helped the world imagine things differently. But today, in our social and political conversations, we tend to suffer from a lack of imagination, right? We fall into the ruts of our role and their role. We see things this way, they see things that way. We are right and they're wrong, usually. The same basic conversations. The same basic roles. There's a stuckness in how we tend to talk to each other. They turn into shouting matches, famously end up on social media. Could it be a lack of imagination in how to talk to each other? How to relate to one another? How to hold on to my values and what matters to me, while also listening and honoring the values of somebody else? It takes imagination to do that, you know. It does. But we get stuck. We get stuck in our ruts. Speaking of being stuck, complaining, by the way, being stuck in those negative places that we can find ourselves sometimes is a lack of imagination too. And listen, I'm not talking about, offering helpful critique. Why don't you try offering some constructive criticism, as the Blues Brothers say? I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about ending up in a place where you just complain about everything, right? But not offering a solution, not being willing to work on it, right? It's no imagination. It's no participation in making things better. Why? It's a lack of imagination. I can find myself in that mindset too, by the way, and it is a deeply spiritual issue. When we complain without offering a solution, We're not in a place of imagination. And you know that friend, you know who I'm talking about here, who seems to be stuck, bless them, and they're always griping about one thing or another, and they show up or they call, and you think, oh, do I have energy for this today? Yeah, they're in that place. And maybe you or I have been in that place. I'm sure I have been in that place from time to time. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about people who have real concerns and real problems and just need a friend and just need someone to listen to them. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the people who seem chronically stuck in complaining. And even when they get what they're looking for, they just find something else to complain about, right? That kind of complaining, does it ever really help? No, shake your head no, it doesn't. Why not? I want you to see this. Being in that kind of a mindset, right, is a freedom from mindset. Coming back around here. Chronic complaining is a freedom from mindset. You think, oh, I've got this problem. If it would just go away, if they would just stop doing that, if things could just be different, it'll all be right. But even if you get that, you just find something else to be upset about, right? You know what I'm talking about here? It's a freedom from mindset without moving into a freedom for mindset. Please hear this. Freedom from anything is wasted without an idea of what we're free for. The good news is this church has imagination in its bones, and imagination is how you get from freedom from to freedom for. This church has a history of imagining amazing things. We have Conway Cradle Care. The church moved in location next to a high school. There's a problem, and we're equipped to deal with it. And it takes imagination then, right, to go step by step to making that a reality. This church does that. This church has imagination. We have a preschool. How many kids are here every day of the week between Cradle Care and our preschool? It takes imagination to do that. We now have a summer day camp child care program. That takes imagination. We had a mission team just go halfway across the world to Kitale, Kenya. That took imagination. To think about what it would be like to have a group of our members go over there and come back and tell us about it. It takes imagination to do all these things. Daily bread took imagination to begin. And we'll keep imagining together because it's not what we're set free from, it's what we're set free for. Our servant in the parable missed it, totally missed that. He thought he had something good going on, right? Oh, I've been forgiven this, I can go out and do what I want to do now. Well, he did, and he ended up in a whole heap of trouble. By the way, do you know how much 10,000 talents is? Probably not. 10,000 talents is an incredible sum of money. It depends on whether you try to translate that into modern day currency or if you translate it by labor hours, which was how currency was determined back then. So, depending on how you do that would make the calculation, some variance in calculations is what I'm trying to say. But it could be anywhere between $200 million or, are you ready for this? $3.5 billion. Dr. Evil here. $3.5 billion he's been forgiven. And he goes out and he finds someone who owes him 100 denarii, which is, a denarii is about, a day's wages or so. We're talking about 4 months of wages, maybe. Several thousands of dollars, nothing to scoff at. Not $3.5 billion. Jesus used those figures for a reason. Because we have been set free from an incredible debt, you and I. By the way, that's so much money, $3.5 billion. It is insane that someone would forgive somebody else that much. It's also insane that anybody could rack up that much debt. Think about it. But we're set free from that. We're set free from our sin. And Paul says, if we're to believe him, that we're even set free from the religious law. I mean, read Paul in the New Testament. The problem is that when we dwell in what we're set free from, and we think that means, well, we can do anything now because we don't have to abide by those laws anymore, those rules. No, and even Paul goes into that. He says it's not what you're set free from, it's what you're set free for. You're free to do all things, but not all things are beneficial. What are we doing with the freedom that Christ has given us? Freedom from is wasted without an idea of what we're free for. Like the servant in the parable. Yeah, we've been given our freedom. Freedom from slavery, freedom from debt, and freedom to write a new story. What's the story going to be? Lately, I've been teasing my kids about reading them a story. It's called The Mezzanine. It's a novel written by Nicholson Baker some 30 plus years ago. It's 130 pages, get this, this is the whole book, describing someone going up an escalator. Sounds riveting, doesn't it? Yeah, he's going up an escalator in an office in a shopping complex. And it's funny to think about. The narrator, who's also the main character, he goes on and on and on about all the wonders of modern life. It features footnotes. Yes, footnotes in a novel, like that he wrote, like not somebody else, an editor came along. Footnotes in a novel about staplers. Which staplers are the best ones? Which look the prettiest? Which function the best? And long diatribes about plastic straws and towel dispensers in the restrooms. Which are the best ones? I mean, it sounds riveting, right? But for all his wonder at the conveniences of technology and consumer products, his life is kind of sad. I mean, his relationships, they're hollow, they're at arm's length, calculating. He never seems to be transformed by any of the things that he does or the people in his life or the things he experiences. His imagination, while vivid, seems to me to be lost and wasted. For all the freedoms and conveniences he enjoys, his life lacks meaning and connection. He probably doesn't sound that different from a lot of people out there. Jesus is warning us, don't squander it. Don't squander the gift that I've given you. Don't fail to imagine better lives for yourselves, your families, your community, the people around you. All made possible by the freedom that God has given us. And we've said this before, but remember, Jesus taught in parables like this because he's trying to spark our imagination. He can tell us you have to forgive or God's not going to forgive you and walk away, but he captures our imagination by telling us a story that we enter into. Why? Because he wants us to be people of imagination. He wants to challenge us to use our minds, to think of the way that things can be better. He wants us to live into the freedom that he's going to give us. So again, how will we respond to that freedom? Will we allow ourselves to be transformed by the forgiveness we've received? Are our hearts changed? Do we have imagination for it? I've been haunted by one other question like that one this week, and I'll end shortly. I encountered this in another book I read lately. The author asked, are you creating a life, or is life something that happens to you? That question has been haunting me a lot. It's similar to this idea we talked about last week of being co-creators in our lives with God and in the world with God, right? Well, are you co-creating your life with God? Are you co-creating this community with God? Or is life happening to you? I'm convinced that the answer to this question will depend on our ability to be changed by God's generosity towards us. Do we have any imagination just what God has set us free for? What have you been set free for? Amen.